everyone, and welcome again to Murphy's Law Garage. This is part 6 of how the Bronco was built before YouTube. Let's go ahead and jump right into it here. Right here you can see the Hydra programmer. We've got the ECU pulled out. You can see that the chip has been installed into the Hydra, into the ECU here. You can also see there is a layer of hot glue right here on the side of the ECU. And that is because the ECU will actually fit, for the 7.3, will fit in the Bronco's ECU slot in the firewall if it has a little bit more girth to it. And that's what you see here, is there's a little bit added to the side of the ECU, and that was to keep it from wiggling around. And that's at the hole where it meets the firewall outside. But inside the vehicle, all I did was put a piece of rubber on the bracket, and it actually squeezes it perfectly tight, and it doesn't wiggle around in there. Here I'm loading the software and the latest firmware on the Hydra for the first time. Alright, so this is the exhaust that I built for the 7.3 Bronco, which actually comes out just in front of the passenger tire. You can see here that it's all painted and heat wrapped real nice. David actually, we're going to end up changing it because David doesn't like that it projects all of that hot exhaust out right next to where someone's standing to get into the Bronco, and trust you me, it is awfully warm. Alright, here's where the exhaust actually comes out the side of the truck here. You can see it all nicely heat wrapped and traveling out the side. This is heading towards the motor right here. Here's our transmission. So what you have there is a video of the Bronco running for the first time with its exhaust on and making lots of pretty whistly turbo noises. Let me actually turn this audio down a little bit, it's too much. Okay. So what you're seeing here is the Bronco being fueled up for the first time. This is actually part of the video that went on 1320video.com and got over 1.5 million views. David's putting some diesel in it over here, and the truck's just idling away. Let's let you all finish watching that. Alright, so that's the diesel Bronco having gone out for its first drive to a fuel station and getting fueled up.
Go for it.
So what's going on here in this video is that's obviously a dead stop hard run, and this was after putting the Hydra on it, and the PCM is responsible for controlling the shifts of the transmission. So we were hoping that the custom tune that we had put into it would help with the transmission shifting so goofy once we had adjusted for the tire size, so on and so forth. And you can hear in this video that the shifts are very slow and it's slipping a lot, so it's still not very happy. Good enough, moving on. So what we see here is the method we chose to use for for gauges on the dash. Now, there was thought into putting the 96 Powerstroke's dash in here and wiring it up to work. The problem is that dash is actually physically larger than this hole, and the only way to have done it would actually have been to cut on this dash to make it fit. And it just so happens to be that a tablet of this size slipped into that hole really well, and because the 96 Powerstroke is OBD2, which is actually strange for that year, we were able to run a Bluetooth ELM adapter and use Torque Pro. So we're using that to give us gauges. Here you have the Sterling 10 1/4 that came out of the F250. And the reason why we basically had to go to this rear end is because the tone ring in here that reads speed off the ABS sensor is physically larger than the one that's in the 8.8, and no matter what we did, we couldn't make that work out with the stock PCM. And not just that, this using this rear end, of course, gave us 3/4 ton, weight load, and it actually made the truck ride better in the end, which is pretty astonishing. So right here you can see a mess of wires on the floor. I'm actually standing next to the passenger side of the driver's side of the truck. And the reason why there's a mess of wires on the floor is what I've done here is I've pulled the F250's harness through the wall, as well as a section of the Bronco's harness, and I'm thinning out everything that doesn't need to be here that in the F250 would have otherwise run up in here to feed radios and speakers and things like that. So what you see left over here is just the absolute necessities for the F250's harness to work. In fact, this right here, this is an integral part. This is the ignition module for the F250, and it's much more digital in the way that it works rather than analog, unlike the Broncos, which uses this really primitive lever on a big switched power up here in the steering console. So what I needed to do was to make the Bronco's big basic analog switched power control everything that the F250s once did without pulling too much power through the Broncos and ruining it. And that's what you see here. So what you're seeing here is I've got all of the power triggers, all of the power lines that once came off of the F250's harness like this. These big yellows here are actually running to some of the glow plug and injector trigger on the engine harness. And I've got all of this piped into a series of, obviously here, 5 relays. And these 5 relays are each individually triggered off of the Bronco's harness for individual things, like for instance accessory power, and then constant power, and then start, all of these things. So all of them each control, each of these relays are triggering their own circuit, and they have their own big power feeding them. And that's how I got the Bronco's harness to light up the F250's harness. Right here we're under the truck, and what's happening here is these white wires you see coming down, they have different colored traces on them. These white wires are actually the wires for the transmission controller. So we have a US Shift Quick 4 transmission controller in this truck, and this was our final, we tried everything to make it shift right, and this was our final option to really get it dialed in. And that is that even though with the Sterling 10 1/4 in the rear we should technically be able to get the truck to shift correctly, it still didn't compensate for the fact that the truck was very light. And being very light, the torque converter lockup patterns and everything, and the stock PCM's inability to learn transmission shifts made that impossible. And I'm not saying it wouldn't work, it would, it just wasn't refined enough, and we really did want a refined experience. So what you're seeing here is the harness for the Quick 4 coming down, and I'm actually wiring it into the harness for the transmission. And then right here you can see I've got a mess of wires on the floor again, and here's the Quick 4 just chilling out by the dash, and I've gone in here and I've put in some custom maps. Now, if any of y'all have watched some of the more recent videos on the Bronco, specifically the build continues, we actually had to fix an issue that was keeping us from using a signal directly off the rear ABS sensor to control the transmission shifts. And previous to that, even with this setup, we were still having to use the PSOM, which is a module that's inside the cluster for the F250. And without that cluster plugged into the F250's harness, or at the very least the module that exists inside of it, an F250 will not shift. If any of y'all have more specific questions about that, y'all should hit me up on any one of the social media accounts if you have any issues with shifting, and I can help you through that, because that was a really big nightmare for us. And some of that nightmare could be avoided, even not really needing the quick 4 if you didn't want to spend the money. Though not ideal, it could be done. So anyways, we had to rewire the ABS sensor using a standalone harness that didn't go through the F-250's old ABS system, so that the quick 4 could read directly off that sensor and avoid all of the junk that once made the transmission shift. Here is the quick 4 controller. You see it's a really nice, handsome looking unit. Now if I had to give US Shift some criticism here, these harnesses that plug into the side of this unit really ought to plug into the back of it, or at least have some 90-degree fittings on it, because it really does make it a nightmare to deal with this module. If you're trying to tuck it into something so you're not looking at all of it, it's hard to install cleanly. Alright, you can see here that all of the wiring that was once laying around right here has now been tucked up into the dash. Alright, here, this is actually the Hydra you see sitting right here with this ribbon cable.
David, give it a rev.
Alright, so interesting phenomena here. You hear what appears to be a lope tune in the truck, and that is not something we did on purpose. So we found out, it just happens to be this generation of truck and the way we had everything set up, if the PCM cannot see the transmission, the truck will do this. It'll constantly act as an open circuit and it will lope. Now you'll hear at the end, it's kind of hard to tell, but when the truck revs up and it comes back down to idle again, it's gone. It'll only do it when the truck first starts. It'll surge really hard like that. So that was caused by going standalone because the computer could no longer see the transmission. Now, we actually got with Poor Boy Diesel Tuning, who sent us a tune for a manual truck for the Hydra, and that cleared up this issue. Now I wanted to point something out I didn't before. And it's hard to see here because the damn switch is in the way, but this is the pedal out of the F-250, and again, you can't see it. The bolts are literally right here. This pedal bolted in. Now the bracket wasn't quite right. I had to bend on it a little bit and eye out one of the holes, but it darn near bolted right in, so that's no big concern for any of y'all when you're putting this in. The pedal assembly from the F-250 will go right in. Ford really didn't, remake the wheel whenever they did this. Alright, so here you have us pulling the 8.8 rear end out of the truck. So the 8.8 is pulled, the 10 1/4 sitting here. Look at the state of the F-250. All of the junk from the Bronco and it just sitting up in the bed, everything stripped off the front of it. Alright, right here we're doing more cleaning up under the truck before we put the 10 1/4 in. You can see the lift pucks right here on the body. Alright, now the 10 1/4 is under the truck. This took a little customizing because we have lift blocks in here. And this was the nail in the coffin actually for the drive shaft in the truck, and we're going to get to that pretty quick here, I imagine. We didn't quite get the angle of the rear end right. So even though the drive shaft was surviving previously, when we put the 10 1/4 in, we would have needed more wedge to face the angle of the rear end up. And because we didn't have it, it ended up being too flat, and well, it hurt ended up hurting the drive shaft. Here you can see how much lift the truck actually ended up with after putting the 10 1/4 and these heavier springs in. This is like a full-on big old level. I forget how long this thing is. Oh look, David says right here that level is 6 foot tall. So it did come down some once the suspension leveled, but this truck is very tall. You can see a rear shot here of just how tall it sits with the 40s. We hadn't put the 40s on the front just yet because we needed some custom adapters to go from 5 lug to 8 lug. And yes, we are still running the Dana 40 up front. with the IRS, and that is because we live in South Louisiana. We're not rock crawling around here. All the 4x4 is ever turned on for is to get out of a mud hole if the truck gets stuck. Here's the digital dash being showed off. You can see I actually cut a piece of plastic board here, and it's screwed into the dash. What we did is we ordered a case for the tablet, and then I epoxied the case to this plastic, and then the tablet is popped into it. You can see its connector. I've got a 90-degree fitting here. It runs through the plastic. And then we also have the Hydra sitting right here next to it. Right here you have the Quick 4, which if you trim this plastic, I forget what was here, I think this might have even been a blank plate, but if you trim the plastic out right here real neat, you can actually slip this Quick 4 right in the hole and it looks perfect. That switch is actually doing nothing. Here's another angle. Alright, so this is the Bronco outside. It's got its 40s on the front for the first time. You can see that nice big tire. Truck looks really good and proportional. Here's me actually prepping for the fenders to be cut. So once we had the tires on, we could see exactly what needed to come out here. You can actually see this is the sway bar relocation that I did. It's hanging down too low. So I ended up having to cut the corner off of this, as well as the fenders are both cut at this angle on the front. You can see I've actually performed the cut here. And I took this fender liner, I just sucked it back in. So I kind of pie cut both halves of the skin, because this is what it looks like if you cut it open. Then I pinched it together like that. You see it's pinched, and then ran a bead, little tacks, all the way down it until the two were joined together, and then came back and ground it so it looks really nice and clean. You see I've got it primered in. This is still what it looks like on the truck to this day. Oh, and this is where things went bad. So we're going to stop here for now because we're up to about 18 minutes on this video. And the next video will most likely be the last, even if it takes a little longer than the rest of them. I really do appreciate y'all being here and watching these videos. All of our social media is linked down below, so y'all go check that out, including the link to the album where you can see this specific photo album of all the pictures if you need to refer back to them. Again, thank you very much. Y'all have a good one.